We want to go ahead and bring in Dr. David Schwartz. He is the psychologist and director of the Oakland University Counseling Center over at Oakland University, which, by the way, you are our Facebook partner of the day, and we appreciate that. Hello, Doctor. How are you?
Good. How are you guys doing? Thank you for having me.
This is a tough time for everyone. And I think 5 months into it, in the beginning, people were adjusting. Students are going to start going back to school. Are you worried that there's going to be more students in need of your services?
Oh, certainly. I think pretty much every expert across the board and even some recent research that just came out is showing that we're really expecting a surge in demand for mental health services. I just was reading about yesterday a new study put out by the CDC that said that they pulled a bunch of 18 to 24-year-olds to see how they have been doing in terms of their mental health and emotional well-being. And 1 out of 4 of them indicated that in the month of June, they seriously contemplated suicide. So we are already seeing higher rates of depression, higher rates of suicide, or thoughts of suicide anyways, higher rates of anxiety, obviously. We're expecting a surge. And if you look at historically at past events that have been major traumatic events, what you often see is there can be a 3 to 6 month delay till you see that surge. And a lot of the reason that is in those first few months, everybody is just, adjusting to everything, and everything is shifting from one day to the next. So thinking about your mental health and your emotional well-being is not a top priority during that time when you're just trying to get your bearing. So usually, oftentimes, you'll see about that 3 to 6 month delay where it's at that point where people start really becoming more aware and recognizing that, they might need help. They are struggling emotionally, struggling with their mental health. So we are certainly preparing for and expecting a pretty significant increase in demand this year.
Are you bringing on additional staff to help with that, or is this going to be a lot of juggling on all of your parts?
Both. I'm happy to announce we do have an additional staff this year. Prior, actually, to the pandemic, we had already added a shared position with athletics, which is a really great position, something we hadn't had at OU, at least not in a permanent role before. And this is a person that's going to spend half their time working with teams and athletes, but the other half the time they're going to be working just as any other counselor within the counseling center. The university has also given us an additional part-time position this year over what we had last year. And then actually in the last 2 years, they had already given us a couple additional part-time positions. So we do have a little bit more staff this year. We're also really working hard to just try and nail down our processes so we can be as efficient as possible, because we know that even with what we have, it's going to be a lot of juggling and a lot of having to triage and work with our limited resources. So,
Dr. David Schwartz with us, psychologist and director of the Oakland University Counseling Center, with us on the Oakland County MegaCast. Dr. Schwartz, the COVID-19 still very much looming over us, especially at our colleges and universities as students prepare to return to learning. Has your department had a move to telemedicine as opposed to having in-person meetings, or having a little bit of both?
Yeah, absolutely. So back in March, I'm very proud of my staff here. In just a very short amount of time, pretty much in just about a week or under 2 weeks, we not only moved our location, but we also shifted completely to teletherapy. There were a couple of us on the staff, like myself, who had familiarity and have done some of that prior in our private practices or in prior positions. But for the most part, it was new for a lot of our clinicians. So we spent a week of intensive training and shifted over to that. And the plan for this year is actually to do the vast majority of our services through either a HIPAA-compliant video platform that we have or through phone sessions. Some students prefer phone, some students prefer doing the video. But that's going to be the primary way we deliver our services this year for a number of reasons. One, obviously the top most important reason is just being able to follow those guidelines that the CDC and the governors are putting out. A lot of our offices don't have enough space to have that 6 feet of separation even the ones that do. And as you can imagine, in therapy, people are emotional, they're crying. It can be, it's a closed room. So we're really going away from the in-person appointments as much as possible this year. Now, that doesn't mean that we're not doing any in-person appointments. There are going to be certain extenuating circumstances where on a case-by-case basis, and we have a set of criteria that we're going to look through to see if in-person isn't appropriate for somebody. And for example, if we're working with somebody that we think might need hospitalization, that might call for an in-person meeting. Somebody who is having severe psychosis or paranoia about technology, that's not that person. Video sessions are not going to be a good fit. Also, some trauma survivors, it'd be a better fit for them to be in person. So there will be some in-person appointments available. For the most part, we're going to try and limit that as much as possible, just to keep things as safe as possible, and use the video and phone formats for our services.
So because this is so new for all of us, I think everyone has had their moments of depression. If I'm a parent or just as a human and I'm looking out for people around me, are there signs to look for? How do we know when someone actually needs professional help?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I think you're right. I think I think we have to recognize that over the past 5-6 months or so, everybody's baseline anxiety is significantly higher. Everybody is dealing with more stresses. I mean, there are exceptions, obviously, as there always are, but for the most part, we're all dealing with the uncertainty that we're living in right now, and that certainly creates a tremendous amount of anxiety and stress and depression. In terms of warning signs, there are a lot of warning signs. Some of the key ones I always like to point out to people is more than anything, especially for parents or significant others or people you know really well, is trust your gut. Even if the person you're talking to is saying all the right things and telling you everything right, if your gut is telling you, if that spidey sense is tingling, that something's going on there, trust your gut and keep asking questions. Some of the things I would ask people to look for is it's very common, particularly for depression and severe anxiety, for people to start withdrawing more, significant personality changes where maybe somebody once was more extroverted and now they're becoming more withdrawn and isolated. They're not doing the things that they would normally engage in that bring them joy. So any significant personality changes, any changes in behaviors, particularly looking at substance use. We know that substance use rates are of course spiking during this time with the increased stress and people being cooped up at homes. So looking for behavioral changes, personality changes, signs of withdrawal. A lot of times, one of the things that often gets missed or overlooked is irritability. It's very common for depression to come out in that way. And actually, I just saw research the other day that confirmed that we are all angrier right now. That baseline has gone higher too. So looking for that irritability, or people listening very closely to how people talk and the things they're saying. If you're noticing that they're saying things that are much more pessimistic about themselves or about the future, or there's the hopefulness is not there, those are certainly things you want to key into. And I always tell people, trust your gut and don't be afraid to talk to people and ask about it. And especially if you're worried that somebody might be feeling suicidal. Your gut is telling you something like that might be going on. Do not be afraid to ask them about that. A lot of times people worry that they might give them the idea, or that, it's not an easy thing to talk about. Even therapists, everybody, when we're talking about something so serious, it raises your anxiety to ask those questions. But it's so important to ask those questions, because the worst case scenario, if it's not true, they're just going to tell you, no, it's not, I'm not having those, and they're actually going to feel supported because they will recognize this is coming from a place of compassion. But research has shown pretty clearly just the act of asking somebody if they're suicidal, especially if you're the first person to ever ask them that will significantly reduce the chances that they will ever act on those thoughts, that if they get a chance to actually open up and talk about it.
Dr. Schwartz, following up on that, a lot of times people that are in these situations, that are having these feelings, are often putting themselves in a state of denial about them also. They don't want to believe that they are having an anxiety episode or that they are feeling these feelings of depression. And so for those either on the outside looking in and seeing these people that they love and these people that they know feeling that way, or for those people that are feeling that way but are trying to convince themselves that they're not, what steps should be taken then to lead those people toward getting the help that they need?
Well, it's one of the toughest situations when you have somebody that you love and you see them struggling and really hurting, and you want to be able to help them. You want to be able to fix it for them, but you can't do that. But what we can do, though, is be supportive. We can tell them about the help that's out there. We can encourage them to seek it. Can't force them to do it. They have to want to do it on their own for it to be most effective. But I think listening, active listening, and not, and letting the person be heard, being compassionate about how you approach them too. Finding ways to talk with them, and asking them why are they hesitant, in not a way that's going to cause them to be defensive, but in a genuine way. Like, what are some of the reasons you're worried about? And maybe they might have some misconceptions about therapy, because there is a lot of stigma and a lot of misconceptions about therapy, what therapy is. But what we do know is it works. I mean, research has shown over and over again. For something like depression, for example, close to 90% of all people who come into therapy walk away feeling fulfilled, and like depression is not a significant issue in their life again. And what I often tell people is, even if you don't believe it's going to work, and even if you don't want to go for 1 or 2 sessions just to see what it is. And chances are you're going to find what was helpful. And if it's not, at least you can say you tried. You don't have to sign up for a lifetime of appointments or 10 appointments or anything like that. But really try and approach them with compassion. I always recommend, I know it's cliche, but it works really well, when talking with somebody, use I statements instead of you statements. When we tend to use you statements, it feels like you're pointing a finger, and people inherently just get more defensive. But when you talk about the I statements and what I have been seeing, and focusing on not things that are too personal, like the behavioral changes. Like, for example, if somebody is a student that's normally a really good student and they're withdrawing and their grades are dropping, focus on those changes and using that as a starting point to talk with them. And then I'd also say, if you have somebody, especially if you're a parent or a loved one, and they're really resistant, give me a call. Give one of any of our staff here at the Counselor Center a call. We are here Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, and we love when people call to pick our brains and consult, because we're often, based on hearing the specific situation, able to give really good advice about how we can approach it with that person, what type of things you can say that might help them see that this could really be a huge benefit for them.
David Schwartz with us on the Oakland County MegaCast, director of the Oakland University Counseling Center. We talk a lot about the students, but what about the parents, especially first-time parents sending their kids off to college? I would imagine if they're stressed, could it be transferred to the student? And what advice do you have for parents?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, especially first-time parents and incoming freshmen, in normal times, that's a stressful period, right? And it's a new dynamic that both their child, and the parent are going to have to adjust to, right? Because it's a natural period of life where their children are gaining more independence and trying to figure out who they are and do more things on their own. And there's a balance there between wanting to be involved in their life, but not over-involved, and not, too distant either, though. And that's a really stressful, challenging balance. And it's not the same for everybody. Every parent is going to have a different balance there. One, I would recommend parents to trust your guts. You know your kids better than anybody, and you kind of know what they might need, but also listen to your kids and what they need. Yes, it's this year more than ever that I imagine parents are going to be very stressed out, because on top of all the normal stresses, now we have all these other stresses added on top of it. I think trying to really put things in perspective is helpful. If you're a parent and you notice your anxiety is kind of maybe getting out of proportion, or it's not being coming out in a healthy way, maybe that's the time to take a step back and, kind of process it yourself. Do some of your own self-care before you talk to your kids about it, because you're absolutely right. If a parent is overly anxious, it's very likely their kids are they're going to pick up on that. Anxiety can be very infectious, right? And so I think having as many conversations as needed to talk about it, to process it with your children. I think good communication is going to be critical this year, both before, as they're transitioning in, but even once the students are on campus too.
Dr. David Schwartz with us, the director of the OU Counseling Center, with us on the Oakland County MegaCast. And Dr. Schwartz, as we're approaching the beginning of the fall semester, particularly for those incoming freshmen, those first-time university students, but really for everybody coming back, whether it be a student, whether it be staff member, whatever the case may be, what are some coping strategies that you and your staff are suggesting to people as they're dealing with the added stresses and anxieties of educating during the pandemic?
Well, I think there's a number of things. One, I would say every year, regardless of what's going on, which is know your resources on campus, because like most universities, Oakland University has a tremendous amount of resources available to students. And yes, things might look a little differently in terms of how those resources are accessed this year, but there's not going to be any drop off in services. I know for us with our teletherapy, I know a lot of students might be a little hesitant about that. But actually, research has been pretty clear on this. There's been a number of studies now that show that there really isn't a drop-off in terms of effectiveness of the treatment. Now, obviously, I think both therapists and client would much rather be there together, right? And there's some situations where that is better to be in person. But we know from research that teletherapy is just as effective. So know your resources and don't be afraid to reach out and ask for help. Because you can know your resources, but if you're not accessing them, it's not doing you any good. Specifically to this year, some of the tips I've been talking with my clients about is, there's so much uncertainty and unpredictability going on in the world right now. It just seems like from one day to the next, there's new changes and new things we're having to adjust to, right? As we get better science and better understanding of how this all works. I know it's cliche, but we really need to try and find the things in our lives that we do have control over and focus on those, because if we can get out of balance and we can focus on all of the things that are unpredictable, that are out of our control, and that's certainly going to just cause our anxiety to skyrocket. So find the things that you can focus on that are in your control, that especially things that make you happy. I think self-care, I'm always preaching self-care, but more than ever this year, self-care is going to be critical, especially since we're going to have to find creative ways of doing self-care, because a lot of the typical ways that we maybe normally would do them, going to the gym or going to hang out with our friends, we have to adjust to those. So we have to find creative ways of self-care, but certainly there are lots of ways we can still perform self-care. And I really, really hope that everybody makes it a regular daily thing for them. I always preach that we should be treating self-care just like we treat our schoolwork, our work, sleeping, eating, all the things that we consider necessary for living and being successful. Self-care should be right at the top of that list. So when I have students write up their weekly schedules, if I'm helping them do time management, things like that, I make sure that they're actually putting time for self-care in there, that we're actually scheduling it. Because if you just expect it to happen, oftentimes it's one of the first things that drops off the list. Another thing, and this speaks to the kind of overall theme of finding a balance with things, is know your limits. Everybody is different in where their limits are. And I think it's helpful to be aware of what's going on in the world and be knowledgeable about the pandemic and knowledgeable about what's going on with the social injustices that have now been really coming to the forefront too. That's great, but everybody has a limit where it becomes a point where we're no longer consuming information to gain knowledge, and it's now hurting us. And it's different for everybody. And a good rule of thumb is if you're online and you're reading something and you get to a point, especially if you're about to comment on something and your hands are shaking but the adrenaline's going, that's a sure tell sign that you need to take a step back, take a break, and unplug. I've been recommending to people to take kind of social media breaks from time to time just to kind of recharge. And just trust yourself. Know when you need to kind of take a break, plug in, recharge, do some of your activities, your self-care activities, whether it's mindfulness. There's a lot of great apps out right now for mindfulness. In fact, I believe Governor Whitmer actually worked with Headspace, one of the most popular mindfulness apps, and it has a free version, but the paid version is free for all Michigan residents this year. I highly recommend people download that app among many other apps. Use those tools that are available to us to engage in proper self-care and find that balance in terms of the information you're consuming. I heard a term recently, and I think it's a perfect term of doom scrolling, where people are scrolling on their Instagram or Facebook feeds, and it's just one negative story after another. And that can take a significant toll on us. So we have to really be careful about how much of that we consume.
All great advice. I will say I've stopped going on Facebook as much
Yes.
during all of
Yeah.
this. Before we let you go, students and parents, if they want more information about your services, how can they get that information?
Well, number of ways. There's our website. We're actually right in the process right now of completely updating and overhauling our website. So we've already got it somewhat updated, and over the next week or two, there's going to be some more updates. And so make sure to check that out. But you can always call us. We are always happy to talk with students, parents, professors, whoever it is. And it doesn't have to be an appointment. It could just be a 10-minute consultation on the phone where maybe you have a friend you're worried about and you just want a little advice on how you should approach them and handle it. Give us a call. There's nothing else I want people to take away from this is that help is available. Please do not be afraid to reach out to us and ask us for help for yourself, for somebody you're worried about. Pick our brains. We're here. And if you ever met therapists and psychologists before, we love to talk about this stuff. So we're always happy to take those calls. So give us a call if you have any concerns, especially if you're struggling yourself and you want to set up an appointment. One of the nice things we have in the clinic this year is we created what we're calling our Zoom rooms. Now, we're not using Zoom technically because we're using a HIPAA compliant platform, but it has a nicer name. What that is for some students who live on campus or at home, they might not have a private space to be able to do the teletherapy, or they might not have a good internet connection or the right computer equipment. So we have a couple of rooms that we've reserved here at the clinic where students can call and reserve those, where they can come in and have a quiet space to have their session with their therapist. So again, just don't be a stranger. Don't hesitate to call us, or another way would be to email us. We're always constantly checking our emails. All of our individual emails are on our webpage as well. And as the director of the Counseling Center, I'm always happy to talk with parents, students, staff, faculty. So don't hesitate to give me a call as well.
Thank you so much for being with us on the Oakland County MegaCast